Good afternoon. This is Michael Munson with Forge, and I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar on violence and trauma in the lives of transgender older adults. I'm here today with Loree Cook-Daniels, Forge's Program and Policy Director. Actually, that's backwards, Policy and Program Director. And we are excited to have you all here and get moving with the subject for today. We wanted to just do a couple of reminders before we get moving, and one of those reminders is that we are not going to be covering Transgender 101 materials in today's call. We always try to balance the needs of who is here and the knowledge level of who's here, and we know that some of you may have extensive Trans 101 knowledge, and some of you may want or need to have more knowledge around those core transgender issues. So if you do need to have more 101 issues, we hope that you will look at our website and find one of our many archived recordings that cover Transgender 101 issues. You'll see our web address on every single slide as we move forward, and you can easily find our 101 webinars from there. So we'd like to get going and cover a few ground, kind of not ground rules, but housekeeping items, and then move on with our subject. So the couple of housekeeping items are that we do encourage everybody to take care of yourselves. And I know many of you have been on our webinars before or have been at an in-person training of ours. So we encourage you to take care of yourself, because sometimes content is upsetting or startling or just stressful, and sometimes we can't deal with it at the moment. So we encourage you to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. And one of the things that we can offer you that will allow you to take care of yourself is that we will be sending out the PowerPoints tomorrow, and we're recording the session. So if you need to step away for any reason, you can come back to it as of tomorrow, and the recording is posted on our website. We'll be asking you to do some interacting with us if you'd like to do that, and there's a couple ways that you can interact with us. One is through the question area. Generally, people see that on the right side of their screen, and I'm wondering if people could type in, how about the state that you live in, just so that we can all find where that question area is. Excellent. So I'm seeing a bunch of people typing in where they're from, and that's great. And I know some people don't have access to be able to type things in. So excellent. It looks like the majority of you are finding that question area. So that is the area that you can ask questions throughout the webinar today, technical questions or questions about content. And I will let you know ahead of time that Loree and I are the only two people that are monitoring that area. So we'll try to tag your questions and address them at the end of the time today. So the second way that we will ask to have some interaction with you is through polls. And I think most of us have seen these on webinars or at other things, so they're pretty self-evident about how to interact. So we'll ask a question, and then you'll have some choices on the screen that you can click on. So we encourage you to join us in that way when we get to those places. So before we get into the content, I just wanted to offer a little bit about who Forge is and what we can offer you as providers, since some of you may not be familiar with what services we have to offer you. So we have kind of a split focus. One is on training and technical assistance for providers, and the other, which is a much smaller area, is direct support that we offer for transgender survivors. So when we look at training and technical assistance, the four major areas that we can offer you support are through one-on-one contact. So if you write us or email us about a challenge that you're having or something that you might not know about transgender people, populations, or survivors, or how to help trans people access services, we are more than willing and able and eager to help you try to figure out some solutions to those challenges. The second way that we provide training and technical assistance is through webinars. So this is one of our regular monthly webinars. So they're every month, and you can join us for as many of them as you'd like, and we always like to see familiar faces back every month. The third way is through training. So we do a fair amount of training at conferences, both mainstream conferences and trans conferences, as well as are recruited to go to specific communities or agencies to do in-person trainings. And we always love that opportunity because in-person trainings offer something a little bit different than what we can do by phone or webinar. And the fourth thing that we can offer you is through the publications that we have on our website. There are many of them, and we are constantly adding more. So we encourage you to look around and find what it is that you might need or want. When we switch over to the transgender survivor side, we have 4 things that we offer. And again, this is a little bit more limited in scope. We have a couple of listservs for transgender survivors and loved ones, just to have a space where people can connect to each other 24 hours a day if they want to reach out to each other. So it's a peer-based listserv. The other way that we can support both you and transgender survivors is through our fairly large referral database. So you may need to connect somebody with a therapist in your area or a support group in your area. We can try to do that either directly through you or through a transgender individual that contacts us. The other 2 things that we offer for transgender survivors are really exciting to me. The first is Writing to Heal, which is an online trauma-informed group. We just started a new group of that, and we are just, I think it's one of the most fun things about my job that I get to help facilitate this process for survivors. So literally, if a survivor can access a computer and the internet anywhere in the country, they can join the group. It's that simple and it's that easy. And it sometimes offers healing resources that they can't access in local communities for a lot of different reasons, some of which we'll talk about later. And then the 4th thing that we offer for transgender survivors is a relatively new project called the Espavo Project, where we're empowering survivors to have their photograph taken in whatever way that feels really comfortable to them, and then helping them to create a statement of resilience and healing so that their healing can move the next step forward. So that's the snapshot of what we can offer you. We are really grateful for the Office on Violence Against Women, who continues to support this webinar series and much of our other work. So we are grateful that they value this and we can bring these webinars to you. So a little bit about who's who. I'm not going to talk very much about who we are, but sometimes we've had guest speakers in the last few months, and we'll have some additional guest speakers coming up, but today's call will just be me and Lori Cook-Daniels. Both of us are Forge staff. So what we are going to do today is, our agenda is 6 points. One is we're going to talk a little bit about what trauma is, just to kind of get a baseline understanding about what we're talking about when we refer to, when we use the word trauma. We'll next talk about data and the data that we do have on older trans people and trauma, and there's a growing amount of data, so I think you'll be surprised and interested in seeing some of that data. We'll then talk about the health implications of trans people who have experienced traumatic events, and that might be interesting as well in a different way. There's some data around that as well. We'll then move on to talk about accessing services and support as traumatized trans older adults. So that will mostly be talking about barriers to accessing those services. And then we'll next move into talking about resilience. So some of the things that trans older adults may have that are assets or are benefits that can actually help them access services or heal or become more resilient as time goes on. And then we'll wrap up with some resources and some Q&A. So we're going to start with a poll, and Lori's going to read us a list of questions after this starts going.
Yes, we'd like you to click yes on the poll if you have witnessed or experienced any of the following items on the list we'll be reading. Have you witnessed or experienced a car accident, a natural disaster like a tornado, hurricane, flood, or earthquake, an invasive or painful medical procedure or surgery, combat or war, death of a loved one from suicide or murder, sexual abuse or assault, domestic violence or partner abuse, or a public event like 9/11 or the Boston Marathon bombing. If you didn't experience any of those, please check no now. Otherwise, check yes. Okay, so the results are 98% of us have experienced at least one of the traumas, one of the things that fall under trauma. Only 2% said they hadn't experienced none of them. All of these things and more can be considered trauma or traumatic. This is true for people who directly experience these things or people who witness them. Not everyone who experiences or witnesses these kinds of events ends up experiencing long-term trauma, but many do. Michael?
Great. Thanks, Lori. So the kinds of trauma that we just asked you to respond to can happen to anyone of any gender, any age, any identity, any sexual orientation. In addition, transgender older adults may experience trauma that comes in the form of things like transphobia or homophobia or biphobia, in which someone is discriminated against because of their gender identity or because of their sexual orientation. Transgender older adults may also experience trauma that comes in the form of ageism. Obviously, anybody who is aging can experience ageism, but trans people can as well. Transgender older adults may experience trauma in the form of elder abuse, such as financial exploitation or the refusal to provide care. So that can also include things like neglect or by self or others. Transgender older adults may experience trauma that comes in the form of hate crimes based on gender identity or sexual orientation. Transgender older adults may experience trauma that comes in the form of minority stress, which is the day-to-day emotional and physical wear and tear that comes from being treated as less than or not as good as other people. And trans older adults may experience trauma that comes in the form of public referenda. So things like voted rights, like the gay marriage issues that are being talked about widely now, or school access around gender identity and things like that. So sometimes those have both positive impacts, but they can also have some traumatic impacts for trans people. The American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it's the guidebook for all mental health providers that provide both medical billing codes as well as diagnostic criteria. They classify trauma as part of the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder in this way. The person was exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence. And it needs to include one of the following. So direct exposure to a traumatic event, witnessing in person a traumatic event, indirectly by learning that a close relative or a close friend was exposed to trauma. If the event involved actual or threatened death, it must have been violent or accidental. Repeated or extreme indirect exposure to aversive details of the events, usually in the course of professional duties, like first responders who oftentimes see a lot of crime and difficult situations, professionals who are repeatedly exposed to the details of child abuse, are just a couple of examples. So this does not include indirect non-professional exposure through electronic media, television, movies, or pictures. So obviously this is a clinical definition, and it's useful, and it doesn't necessarily encompass many of the experiences that people have that feel traumatic or result in the need for services. Trauma can have different effects or show up differently depending on where in the life course the individual is when it happens. For example, trauma experienced in childhood can disrupt normal developmental processes, including how the personality develops and the extent to which a person develops emotional regulation skills. These in turn can affect a person's ability to successfully form and maintain relationships throughout their adulthood. When trauma occurs during adulthood, the consequences are often managed through or worked through, and sometimes may seem to disappear or get resolved. Of course, many adults can't manage or work through their traumas, but a lot of times adults can a lot more than children. In elderhood, a new trauma can occur, such as being the victim of an assault or domestic violence. In addition, older adults can be suffering from an old trauma that they've had symptoms from for decades. It also frequently happens that old traumas that seem to have been resolved or have gone kind of underground re-emerge during later life. So we'll talk a little bit more about that re-emergence later on in the webinar. Some people are really easily able to list key elements of trauma, while other people work with trauma survivors every day, but have a harder time kind of making that list of what these key symptoms are. Some people might have never thought about the components of trauma, but they can recognize it when they see it. We wanted to articulate some of the key elements of trauma just so that we have them kind of as our working knowledge as we move today. So fear is one of the key elements of trauma, and I think that's fairly self-explanatory. Fear can come in many different formats, but fear is a key element. Another key element is a feeling on the part of the victim that they lack control and that they're helpless to stop what is happening or what did happen to them. Typically, trauma victims feel that they are going through the trauma alone, even when other people are present. So again, that's about what happened during the time of the trauma, as well as what might be happening when they're re-experiencing or coping with trauma. After the trauma, victims typically find that their beliefs about life and other people have changed, or at least have been challenged. They may wonder what the meaning of life is, and they might lose their faith, either religious faith or their faith maybe in the goodness of people or their trust in people. A victim's immediate physical reactions are limited to fight, flight, or freeze. A lot of us, hear that and talk about that a lot. And we can also see that play out when a victim maybe 20 years out or 30 years out from their traumatic event, and they still are having those same reactions to some of the stimuli that they experience in their day-to-day life. And the last key element that we'll share today is that victims typically experience disruptions or distortions in their memory, which can extend far beyond the trauma itself. So when we talk about older people, I think Lori's going to talk a little bit later about where and how that may play a role with dementia or other issues that affect memory. Some of you who have been on our webinars before or been in person with us have seen that we often use a lot of images of trans folks and of survivors, and this is no exception. We really like to do that because to me it helps us remember the humanness of what we're discussing, and it helps us better relate to who we're talking about, so transgender people. So the photos that we're going to be using in today's webinar are used with the permission of the individual or the individuals in the images. And we're really grateful that they're willing to share their picture so that we can share them with you. And Lori's going to talk to us a little bit about data.
Yes, I'd like to do a very quick overview of some of what we know about trans older people's experiences with trauma. We have a number of data sources in what we'll be discussing. The Injustice at Every Turn study was published in 2011. It was the largest study we have to date of transgender people with 6,400 trans participants. We'll talk a little bit about some of the statistics from Caring and Aging with Pride. This was also a 2011 study. This one focused on LGBT older adults. We'll be able to show you some data from it about how older trans people differ from older lesbian, gay, and bisexual people who are not transgender. We're also going to speak about several Forge studies. In 2005, we surveyed 265 trans people from across the country about their experiences with sexual assault, and we'll be talking about some of those results. In 2007, we conducted a pilot study on elder abuse among trans people, which had 56 participants. In 2007, we conducted a survey on trans people's sexuality with a total of 1,155 respondents. And in 2011, we surveyed more than 1,000 trans people about possible barriers to accessing sexual assault services. So that will be from us. Finally, we're going to mention the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's ACE study, which involved more than 17,000 participants from the general population. So before I go into this chart, I want to say what the acronyms are on the left side of the chart. IPV stands for Intimate Partner Violence or Domestic Violence. And adult SA is Adult Sexual Assault. CSA would be Child Sexual Assault. This chart is added not to show prevalence rates of each of these categories, but to help solidify the concept that trans people experience multiple forms of violence, abuse, and assault across their lifetime. This data is from a 2011 study Forge conducted. This particular question was a throwaway, one piece of demographic data we collected, which was a minor part of the entire survey. We asked people to simply check the box if they had experienced any of these forms of violence. What the chart means is that 84% of people who checked the box for stalking, you see the 84% there, for example, also experienced at least one other form of violence that was listed. So they also experienced dating violence, adult sexual assault, child sexual assault, something like that. Again, this chart indicates that trans people are experiencing multiple forms of violence and multiple types of violence at very high rates. One of the facts about trans people and violence is that we begin experiencing this violence early on. In Injustice at Every Turn, 23% of the respondents who were under age 55 said they'd experienced physical assault in school because of their gender nonconformity. This figure, interestingly, was a little lower for trans people who were 55 and older, possibly because fewer of them showed gender nonconformity in school. And I'll come back to that a little later. Multiple studies have found that between half and 2/3 of transgender people have experienced sexual assault at some point in their lifetimes. Of the 272 trans people age 50 or older who took our sexuality survey, 47% answered yes to a question asking if they had ever experienced sexual assault or domestic violence. Those of you who have done your own surveys may recognize from that figure that we worded that question pretty poorly and putting the two together. It's important to note that one of the places where trans people were sexually assaulted or are sexually assaulted is in the workplace. Injustice at Every Turn asked whether respondents had experienced sexual assault in their workplace because of their gender identity, which may mean that people who thought they'd been targeted for other reasons did not answer yes. That survey found that 6% of those under 55 had been sexually assaulted in the workplace because they were transgender. The percentage was half that for transgender people who were 55 and older. However, it is critical to note that virtually all of the respondents who were older than 55 had been living in their true gender a very short period of time. So they may have had much smaller windows of vulnerability than those who had been living years or decades in their affirmed gender. I looked at the question and correlated the question of when did you transition with the findings that we were getting for the older trans people in this study when we broke it out, because the figures for the older trans people were quite a bit different in many cases from the figures for younger trans people. And I think that the difference is because almost all of the older trans people who responded are late in life transitioners. Rates of intimate partner violence are roughly the same for people of all gender identities and sexual orientations. There is some newer research that is suggesting that rates might be higher for transgender and lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, but the data is still not conclusive on that. The Caring and Aging with Pride survey found that transgender older adults were more than twice as likely as their lesbian, gay, and bisexual older adult peers to admit that they had experienced domestic violence, 16% compared to 7%. The Injustice at Every Turn study again found rates of domestic violence lower for older adults. But we need to keep in mind that this question also asked people if they had experienced domestic violence because of their gender identity. And the older respondents had been living as their affirmed gender for relatively short periods of time. We wanted to give you a couple other statistics to think about. This one from Injustice at Every Turn shows that 8% of the trans respondents under age 50 had experienced physical assault in public because of their gender identity, compared to 3% of the trans respondents over age 50. Again, the older ones have had less time in their target gender, but it may also be that older people are not physically assaulted as often as younger people. This data is not directly about abuse, but does indicate that trauma from military service may be far more common for trans people, and particularly for trans elders, since there is such a high prevalence of transgender veterans. While 20% of all Injustice at Every Turn respondents had served in the military, 54% of those who were 65 and older had. In 2007, Forge conducted a small pilot study designed to uncover cases of elder abuse of trans elders. We asked about all the usual types of elder abuse: physical violence, sexual violence, emotional abuse, neglect, self-neglect, financial exploitation, and abandonment, plus 2 types of discrimination that we know trans people commonly experience: healthcare discrimination and housing discrimination. Most of the respondents were not elders, but the answers were very intriguing. 65% said that they had experienced emotional or psychological abuse more than once, and 27% said they had experienced self-neglect. Now, we had defined that self-neglect in a somewhat unusual way. We defined it as self-neglect. This usually occurs when someone is too ill or depressed to take care of their own basic needs like food, cleanliness, and safety. But it still surprised us that in the field we tend to think of self-neglect as only affecting older adults. And this survey showed that a lot of younger people felt that they had been self-neglectful as well. Another intriguing finding we had from that study is that trans people's definition of abuse may differ considerably from what those terms mean legally. For example, many trans people said they had experienced abandonment by friends and loved ones, but the stories they told would not fit into what abandonment means to those who work in elder abuse. Similarly, many trans people defined denial of access to public bathrooms as abuse, even though that is not an example most people would use for elder abuse. We have a quote here. One of our survey respondents noted, "I am presently living alone to eliminate in-home abuse by her former husband. However, that increases my medical risk and also eats up all the money needed for medication and medical care. It's a lose-lose situation as of this moment." We included that because it shows how one type of an abuse can affect other parts of a life. So we've got another poll for you. What percentage do you think of transgender midlife and older adults who were sexually assaulted believe that they were assaulted because of transphobia or because of their gender identity? 13%, 34%, or 55%? You can mark it now, please. Michael, can we see the results? Okay, so the most guesses came for the 55%, and you are right. In 2 of Forge's surveys, we asked people how often they thought their perpetrators were motivated by anti-transgender bias. 75% of the people in our midlife and elder abuse study said they thought anti-transgender bias led to their abuse, as did 55% of our transgender sexual violence survivors. That means that many trans people understand they are sometimes victimized for the same reasons non-trans people are victimized. It also suggests that some of the earlier violence statistics we gave from Injustice at Every Turn are likely undercounts by 1/4 to nearly 1/2, since they all asked only about violence that the victim thought was motivated by anti-transgender feelings. I wanted to take a moment to talk about hate-motivated crimes. Hate-motivated crimes can inflict psychological damage far greater than other types of violence as a result of assaulting the victim's identity, as well as his or her person or property. The psychological toll of violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity is significant. In fact, recovery from bias-based violence takes much longer than recovery from random violence. And the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association went on to suggest that trauma associated with hate crime victimization probably lasts longer than 1 year, perhaps as long as 5 years. We will now move on to the health implications of trauma in transgender older adults. This is where we're going to talk about the ACE study that had over 17,000 subjects. That study looked at whether and how many adverse childhood experiences, which is what the ACE stands for, including physical and sexual abuse and neglect, individuals had, and compared those experiences to their health as adults. The results were extremely strong correlations between how much trauma a person experienced as a child and how many health problems they had as an adult. This chart represents how the researchers explained their findings. They believe that childhood trauma disrupts neurodevelopment, which can then lead to social, emotional, and/or cognitive impairment. Those impairments in turn cause social friction, which leads people to adopt health risk behaviors such as using alcohol or drugs or taking up smoking. Those in turn raise rates of disease, disability, and social problems, and ultimately can result in premature death. You can find out more about the ACE study at the CDC website. This next list is from the ACE study and includes some of the adult health risks and problems that they found were correlated with adverse childhood events. We have bolded some of the health disparities that are most pronounced for trans people based on other studies. That includes alcohol abuse, heart disease, early initiation of smoking, depression, and suicide attempts. Interestingly, the Caring and Aging with Pride study found that trans older adults had significant health disparities compared to non-trans lesbian, gay, and bisexual older adults. This chart shows that the trans elders had significantly higher rates of heart disease, diabetes, asthma, and obesity. In most cases, almost double the rates of their lesbian, gay, and bisexual age peers. Trans people in general experience extremely high rates of suicide attempts. The Injustice at Every Turn study generated the statistic that you may have heard before, that 41% of transgender people have attempted suicide at least once. Interestingly, again in this study, the rates were somewhat lower for the older respondent cohorts. And again, that might be an artifact of those being such late life transitioners. We're not sure. Now we'll return to the question of trauma re-emerging in later life. Studies have estimated that in 13% to more than 50% of post-traumatic stress disorder cases, PTSD cases, symptoms worsen or even develop for the first time in mid to later life. One theory for why this happens is that people in mid to later life often experience events that feel like a loss of control or power. As you'll remember from our earlier discussion, feeling a loss of control or power is a key feature of trauma, and re-experiencing loss of control or power may therefore revive the trauma memories. Such events might include admission to a hospital or nursing home, becoming disabled, illness of a partner, and natural disaster. Trauma memories may also be re-invoked by something that causes severe loneliness, such as death or loss of a partner or children moving out of the house. Trauma symptoms may reemerge when typical coping strategies provide fewer distractions. Many people find that retiring from a job can cause trauma reemergence simply because there is now much more time for those thoughts and emotions to come out. On the other hand, it is possible some people retire because their trauma symptoms, such as chronic exhaustion, insomnia, or irritability, make continued working impossible. Trauma symptoms can reemerge for a reason that is very specific to the trauma the person experienced. For example, a Holocaust survivor may associate being helped to a shower with what happened to people in the concentration camps, or someone who was tied up as a child may be traumatized when restrained in a nursing home chair. Combat veterans may be re-traumatized by news of a new war or terrorism, or an anniversary remembrance of a war event. Finally, older adults may experience trauma symptom worsening or emergence simply due to facing too much stress at one time, or a stress pileup. We have a couple questions that we'd like practitioners to keep in mind as possibilities. Are higher rates of elder depression really trauma reemergence? We do know that in general, older men are more likely to commit suicide than older women. In that age group, men are also more likely to be combat veterans than are women. Does trauma reemergence play a role in those suicides? And when we look at transgender older adults and suicide, as well as their veteran status, is there a gender disparity among transgender older adults and their attempted or completed suicides? We don't have that data yet. Might symptoms of trauma reemergence be mistaken for dementia? For instance, some trauma symptoms include memory loss and confusion. And finally, we're going to turn it back to Michael so you hear a different voice.
Thanks, Larry. And I'm realizing that as I've been listening to this, we've had a lot of numbers coming your way, and I know that sometimes it's really challenging to take all of that in. So hopefully you're staying up with the numbers, and I just wanted to remind folks that you will get a copy of the PowerPoint so you can have them in print and be more easily able to access them and see them. So let's move on to talking about accessing services and support. So this part is really going to be talking about kind of barriers to accessing those services and support. In a study that we conducted in 2004-2005, it was a national study of sexual assault survivors. 9% of the transgender sexual assault survivors reported that at some point in their life they had been forced into mental health care that they did not want. So individuals who were forced into receiving mental health care may feel far less likely, they might be less likely to proactively seek care following an abusive situation or an assault or for any other reason. In fact, those who had experienced unwanted mental health care earlier in life, those experiences themselves may have long-lasting traumatic impact throughout their life, or may emerge later in life as they're remembering their younger life. This 9% also does not include what some people consider as forced mental health care in order to access hormones or surgery. A lot of trans people are required to seek mental health care in order to access basic transition needs. So that 9% is not included with those other factors. We're going to do another poll, and let me just set this up for us. So the question is, transgender elders, 65 and older, are more likely or less likely or just the same, just as likely to be refused health care than their younger transgender individuals. So more likely, less likely, or about the same rates of being refused health care. I'm going to give folks a minute or two to vote. Not a minute, a few seconds to vote. Okay. So what most of you said was that transgender older adults were more likely to be refused health care than younger transgender individuals. So here's the good news. When the screen refreshes, you'll see that, in fact, elders that are 65 and plus experienced almost half less refusal of care than their younger peers. So that's good news. So while some of may have experienced forced treatment, in contrast, many transgender people have experienced being turned away from health care because of their gender identity. When we go back and look again at injustice at every turn, that study found that 19% of all respondents had been refused health care, a figure that was a little bit higher for those who were aged 55 to 64. But as you can see, and like the poll was asking, the transgender adults that were 65 and older actually experienced dramatically less refusal of care. So we wanted to read another quote, and this is from a transgender elder who is a veteran. And this person says, I have decided not to have any life-extending surgery because of past mistreatment by nurses at the Veterans Administration Hospital. So this quote was part of a survey that was prior to when the Veterans Administration issued very trans-positive guidelines and statements that actually are very supportive of trans vets and in terms of accessing care. But this person was mistreated in the past and so may still continue to have these fears moving forward. It's also important to note that trans people have frequently experienced sexual assault and violence at the hands of supposedly helping professionals. For example, again, this is from Injustice at Every Turn. They found that 29% of trans people who had interacted with law enforcement officers had been harassed by those officers. That number is probably a lot higher. I think the 29% is really fairly low. They also found in that study that around 7% had been sexually assaulted by police officers. And that 7% number is consistent with some other studies that have found very similar results. Injustice at Every Turn also found that 26% of trans people had experienced physical violence at the hands of healthcare providers, and 10% had experienced sexual assault by a healthcare provider. So when we look at just these two types of helping professionals, law enforcement and healthcare, it's pretty easy to see why trans people may not want to readily go seek care from healthcare, mental health care, law enforcement, or anything that they see as professional, because they may be worried that they're going to be abused or assaulted or treated poorly again. So some of the additional barriers that trans people might face, especially when we're looking at trauma, like sexual assault or domestic violence, one of those barriers can be the violence against women paradigm. We've lived for a long time with this paradigm, and trauma theorists and practitioners are just at the very beginning stages of looking at the current violence against women paradigm that presumes that all victims are women and all perpetrators are men. And I know that's a really simplistic equation, but that's what the paradigm has been. And it's still commonly believed in the general public, as well as some service providers, that paradigm is still true. The paradigm has resulted in many trans survivors not seeking services at all, or being skeptical or questioning the type of services that they might be able to access if they don't fit that women as victim, men as perpetrators kind of binary paradigm. Trans people, as well as non-trans people, have repeatedly heard that this dominant paradigm is, women victims, men are perpetrators. So when a trans person or anyone doesn't fit that paradigm, how might they be questioning if they're a real survivor? They may question if what happened to them was really abuse, if it doesn't fit that paradigm. It also may lead them to feel really isolated. If they don't fit the definition of what they think violence is, do they feel isolated because they can't talk to anybody or they can't share that with anybody? And might they feel some inhibition around accessing services or talking about their trauma to other people? So another barrier to service that trans people may face is not having identification that matches how they present and what they state as their name and their gender. Again, from Injustice at Every Turn, they found that 41% of people who are living full-time in their affirmed gender do not have an updated driver's license. And most of us know that driver's licenses are really the most widely used form of identification. So this incongruent, and that's a major big quote, the incongruent identification may be used to deny people services, or it might force trans people to come out in order to access services. Many trans people don't want to disclose their trans history, so the need to show documentation can cause fear and lead people to just not enter the door at all of help-seeking agencies. Some providers have asked us, well, why don't people just change their identification documents? And it's important to keep in mind a couple things. One is that cost is a barrier for some people, and we'll talk in a little bit about poverty, but changing identification documents does cost money. And in some states, it's not possible to change all forms of documentation, especially birth certificates are especially challenging in many states. The process is becoming a lot easier with some new laws in many different states, as well as some streamlined processes for accessing passport, name and gender changes, and Social Security Administration changes of name and gender. But cost, again, still can be a challenge for many trans people. So I mentioned poverty. The Caring and Aging with Pride survey found that 48% of its older trans respondents had an income level of twice the poverty line, which can give us an indication as to why people are not changing their identification documents and why they may be struggling with some other needs as well. Another barrier that older trans adults face when they're trying to access help for their trauma symptoms is a lack of cultural sensitivity and provider knowledge about trans people. And certainly this lack of knowledge or the cultural incompetency or the cultural insensitivity can be done intentionally. Sometimes people are cruel or mean or have beliefs, and those play out. Most of the time, though, we are seeing that it is unintentional, that providers are not intentionally trying to cause harm, but they still might be being culturally insensitive. One of the things one of the ways that plays out a lot is through intrusive questions. So we see that intrusive or unnecessary questions are the one thing that trans people most often talk about as being a primary problem when accessing service providers. For example, somebody may go see a physician and they have a cold, but they're asked about their genital status. Or they go to a social service agency and they're asked, about their surgery status or about their real gender. Things like that are intrusive and unnecessary questions. As some of the data we've shown already has demonstrated, trans people also often encounter unequal services or discrimination or even violence when attempting to access services. And part of that cultural insensitivity is what's the cause of that. So some of you may remember a long time ago when you were in high school or college, the Maslow's hierarchy, and this may look really familiar. And you may also wonder why we're putting this in as a barrier for trans people seeking services. We bring it up to remind you that a lot of times those basic needs are not being met for trans people. We just talked about poverty. We've talked about some discrimination. So trans elders might not have had lunch today or yesterday. They may not have adequate shelter and a place to sleep every night. They may not have work because they've been discriminated against. So sometimes before dealing with their trauma symptoms and dealing with getting services related to traumatic history, they may need to have help getting assistance with food or assistance with housing or assistance with some of those basic core needs. Because if they don't have those things, they can't move on to looking at things like healing. One of the things, too, that a lot of trans people are noticing is that they worry that services are going to cost money. So they worry about, can I access this type of service, because they think that they're going to have to pay for it. So if you offer services that are free or low cost, it's really important to mention that to a trans client that walks in the door so that they know that they can still have money to buy their food and their shelter, and they can still access services that are free or no cost. So those were the depressing truths and barriers that trans people face when trying to access services. So let's shift gears and talk about some more positive things and the resilience that trans older adults bring to the table. So the first thing is that if you're working with a trans elder, they're still alive, they're still here. When we talk about trans older adults' resilience, we need to start with the fact that just to survive as a transgender adult at this point in time means that they have automatically had to face and overcome adversity and challenges and have had to develop some coping strategies to do so. Our world is not necessarily the most kind place to transgender or gender nonconforming people. So remember that trans people have pulled together the courage to tell some people in their life or a lot of people in their lives about their transness, and that takes a lot of strength and a lot of courage. So a second part of resilience could be that most trans people have had to get help in order to get where they are. I mentioned this before, that a lot of times trans people need to see therapists who have historically been kind of required by the standards of care before somebody can access hormones or surgery, even if they are totally mentally well and stable. And trans people are often required to see physicians in order to access hormones and surgery, which is kind of obvious. So there's a history of help seeking that trans people are accustomed to. Many trans people also may have accessed local support groups in person or online, or national support groups in order to maintain connections with other trans people, with other loved ones, to get advice, to get emotional support. So all of that shows a history of being willing to seek help that trans older adults may have that may be really useful when we're looking at trauma as well. So the third piece of resilience that we'd like to share with you is about having more time. Because older adults in our society are often retired or semi-retired, they're unlikely to be raising children at this point in time, and they tend to have a lot more time than other adults that are younger. That tends to mean that they have more opportunities to volunteer and to help people, which are both proven antidotes to trauma symptoms. They also have the opportunity to develop new interests, and that can involve connecting to new people, which also is going to help with their trauma, reduction in symptoms, and neuroplasticity, which we'll talk about in just a second. A fourth piece of resilience is around prioritizing what's important. What we know about older adults in general is that they're often better at prioritizing what's important to them than younger adults are, who may have a lot more demands on their time and a lot of different things to deal with. Older adults often are clearer about what they value, and they make conscious choices in line with those values. These characteristics can help traumatized transgender elders shift their focus from coping with trauma to creating meaning in their life. And the last piece of resilience that I'm going to mention today is neuroplasticity, which I mentioned just a second ago. We want to note that I think some of us were taught a long time ago that our brains reach their peak in terms of development at early adulthood and then go downhill from there. That is no longer true. We've definitely found through brain science and neurology that our brains keep on developing throughout our entire lifespan. So setting down new patterns and healing from old traumas is possible at any age, all the way up to when we're close to death. Things that can help neuroplasticity are exercise and healthy diet, and some of those things that all of us hopefully are trying to do anyway. But maintaining exercised mind and body can be very, very useful in increasing neuroplasticity. And we wanted to leave you with some resources before we open up to questions and answers, and we have ample time for Q&A, so that's really great. So let me go through a couple of resources that we want to make sure that you know about. I mentioned a couple of these at the beginning about what kinds of services that we offer, and you'll see a couple of those things in these resources. So one is that we do offer monthly webinars on a wide range of subjects related to transgender people and sexual assault, domestic violence, and stalking, including allied subjects that oftentimes help support providers get a better understanding of transgender people and transgender survivors, as well as more effectively serve trans survivors and loved ones. So we really encourage you to look at our schedule of what's coming up, as well as the archive of many, many, many webinars that we've pre-recorded and are available on the web. So the two that are coming up are, next month we'll be focusing on law enforcement and trans survivors or trans communities, and the month after that we will focus on mental health and therapy and trans survivors. So another resource that we wanted to make sure that you were aware of is the publications that are on our website. And we have publications that are kind of divided into two areas, and they're both applicable for this webinar. So one, we have publications on trauma and anti-violence, and we also have many publications that are on aging. Some of them overlap and intersect, and some of them don't. So you may find some of them to be very useful for future reading. And again, we wanted to mention technical assistance, that we are very open to your calls and your emails, and we know that sometimes trainings can't get to the heart of questions that a specific agency or individual has. So we encourage you to reach out to us, and we will do our best to try to help you figure out what the challenge is, or to help fill in the knowledge gap if you have a knowledge gap, or to help get your transgender client linked to a resource that might be useful to them. So please reach out to us by email or phone, and we'd be happy to work with you. One resource that we highly recommend is the National Resource Center for on LGBT aging. The Resource Center is a program of SAGE, and SAGE is a national organization with chapters throughout the country, and they focus on LGBT elders. Forge has been a partner in the National Resource Center since its inception, and we frequently collaborate on transgender content as well as on LGBT elder abuse, and add that expertise into a lot of their work. So on their website, just to give you a hint as to where to look to find transgender-specific information, if you look on their resources tab, you'll be able to scroll down and see transgender aging is one of the selections that you can make. There are literally dozens of resources listed, and they are fantastic resources. So I encourage you to check those out. Not all of them talk about trauma, but a lot of them are, well, all of them talk about transgender aging, and there's quite a few that talk about trauma as well. So please look at that resource. And then the last resources that we wanted to share are two listservs that we host and run. The first one is the Transgender Aging Network Listserv, so TAN listserv, and it's a list for professionals and providers who work with elders who might be transgender. It's a fairly low volume email list, but we encourage anybody who's interested in transgender aging issues to join the list. And like, again, we promise you that it won't be a high volume, and you'll only receive a few emails a month, if that. On the other hand, the ElderTG list is designed for trans elders and loved ones who are 50 and older. This is a very high volume list. It's a very family-like list. It's a very friendly and close-knit list. And we encourage elders who are trans and over 50, and loved ones who are over 50 connected to trans people, to join this list. And it's a place where, trauma is not the focus, but it's definitely a place where people have developed a lot of trust with each other, and we see a lot of content that does talk about traumatic events, and there's a lot of support that people are receiving peer-to-peer. So that is the content that we had for you, and I know that some people have asked some questions, and we have ample time to go through some of those questions. And Lori, are you able to prioritize our questions and spell them out for us?
Yes, actually at the moment we only have one substantive question, but it's a good one. Yesterday I was talking with a group of trans and indigenous folks about alternative ways of healing outside of therapy and counseling, things like activism and community-based healing. In the theme of resistance, I'm wondering if you have any information about what kinds of activities trans older adults participate in or could participate in to engage in their healing journey that might be outside of counseling or therapy-based healing models.
Lori, I think you should answer that one. Sounds like a great one for you.
Well, Michael did mention what we offer for Forge, which is the ElderTG peer support listserv. We also do offer our online Writing to Heal groups that are open to trans people and loved ones of any age. Michael, I was wondering if you wanted to mention some of the trans spirituality retreats that have taken place.
Sure. There's a couple of things that I'm thinking about. There are a couple of trans spirituality retreats. Holly Boswell is the person who has run many of them. I think she's in North Carolina. and that has been a really useful place for people to go. I'm also thinking about some of the radical fairy events, and radical fairies are typically gay men who have some feminine qualities, and they're very welcoming of lots of different gender identities, and again, very spiritually based, very pagan-oriented. So that's a place where some people are able to access things. I'm thinking about Raven Caldera, who's out in Massachusetts, and he holds retreats and different events that are trans-focused and healing-focused. Again, very kind of earth-based person. So that would be another resource. I'm also thinking about a couple of other things. One is some of the male survivor retreats, which they're now open to working with trans survivors. So it may look like a kind of more traditional way, but I think they do some atypical healing services as well. And I'm also thinking about some of the body electric courses, which are sex-positive healing, and there are some courses now that are open to, retreats that are open to trans people. That's what I can think of off the top of my head. That's a great question, though.
Okay, a next question. You said earlier that anyone considering transition must seek mental health services prior to transition. Are they being directed to trans-positive providers?
Lori, would you like me to answer that?
Yes, please, Michael.
Okay. Hopefully I didn't say must seek mental health services, because the tide is shifting a little bit to a required seeing mental health providers to informed consent models. So some trans people are accessing hormones and surgery through that informed consent model, which is, I think, a lot more friendly and less pathologizing. And then others are going through more of a required, you have to get a letter before you can access transition-related services. So in theory, we always hope that trans people are accessing trans-positive providers. But we definitely know that, you know, how do people get connected with providers? Well, sometimes they go through their local support groups, if there's a trans social support group, and get access to therapist lists through that support group. Sometimes people call LGBT community centers, and sometimes, quite frankly, people look in the yellow pages for a therapist, and you can guess which ones of those have a higher likelihood of being directed to trans-positive providers. Like I think I mentioned earlier, we do maintain a list of trans-positive mental health providers that are across the country, and we're happy to share those references with you or anybody that contacts us.
Okay, we have two questions that are somewhat related. We have someone who says, I really appreciate the research review. Has there been urban-rural breakdowns in the research? I'm wondering if there is a significant difference for trans folks living rurally. And the related question is, do you have any suggestions for those of us working in rural communities? Can you address either one?
I can start to, but I think, Larry, you're going to probably have a better answer than I will. I think what we have mostly right now are anecdotal stories, and I think we have anecdotal stories from trans folks, anecdotal stories from providers who work in rural areas, and we can kind of piece those things together. And my memory is kind of tapping into some things that are common for anybody in rural areas. So sense of community might be different in rural areas than urban areas. There's some pros and cons to that. It might be harder to find trans-specific services or resources in rural areas, but on the other hand, some of the providers might be more adept at dealing with diverse populations in those rural communities. And that's not really answering your question a lot, because I don't think we have data, and Lori might know that answer better.
No, I think the state we're in with our data is, you'll notice we did some 2011 reports and also a whole bunch of surveys that Forge has done, and that's quite frankly a lot of what's out there. People have just not been able to ask the more sophisticated breakdown questions like around rural. Okay, the next question. Do you have any publications or resources that are in Spanish and or geared to the Latino community?
Unfortunately, the quick answer is no, we don't. And we definitely are looking at and interested in translating some of our documents. But I don't know when that's going to happen and when funding might happen around that.
Okay, the next question is, I am a graduate student who did research on exploring the experiences of LGBT adults transitioning into assisted living and retirement communities. My literature review and qualitative research found very limited information on this subject and an attitude that this population was not uniquely vulnerable. While their approach was to treat everyone equally without discrimination, I wonder if there are trainings for retirement community staff to address these issues or resources I could pass on to those I interfaced with about how to provide the most culturally appropriate services to this population. Yes, and the two primary places I would send you is the National Resource Center on LGBT Aging, which has a number of curriculums on working with LGBT older adults. And the Department of Health and Human Services has just issued in the last month or two, it was June, so it would have been last month, a video for long-term care facilities on working with LGBT elders. So those are available, and if you want to, and both of them, you can find both of them through the National Resource Center on LGBT Aging website.
Just to be clear, that website address is lgbtagingcenter.org.
Thank you. Next question. Are there health concerns for being on hormones for extended numbers of years? I.e., do elder trans folk need to have a heads up for specific vulnerabilities health-wise?
Lori, would you like me to answer that one?
Yes, please.
Sure. So we don't have a lot of longitudinal data on health, which is concerning. There's a limited number of longitudinal studies. And the basic answer is we don't really know, but what seems to be happening when there is limited research is we're looking at older people who have been on hormones for a long time, and their health risks are very similar to the gender that they're living in. So if somebody's has transitioned from female to male and has been on testosterone, their health risks are going to be similar to any non-trans man, whose body is filled with testosterone as well. So some of the health risks are really not about being trans, but about what hormonal structure they have. It obviously is, very individual in terms of what health concerns people have that may not be related to hormones or anything trans-specific.
Okay, the next question, or actually it's a comment you may want to respond to. My experience in Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma is that providers in rural areas are even less prepared and informed concerning the transgender community. Do you want to comment on that, Michael?
Well, I think, we all have different experiences with, individual states, either our state or where we've, done support or work. And I think that, we all probably have our own opinions about where there's better services in rural areas and where there's not. I do know that I've probably heard from people in not every state in the country, but a lot of states really feel that they are trying to do a really good job. And I think that more and more places are caring about doing a better job around serving trans folks. So, hopefully those states are not examples of where things are rough, but, might be places that need additional work.
And I would just comment that one of the strengths we do see in rural areas is that community members tend to have strong allegiance to each other. So even though the providers may not know much when a trans person comes in, they may feel really motivated to meet the needs of their neighbor or person that they go to church with, or whoever the trans person is. So while rural professionals may have less formal training, I think that they may have even more of a commitment to meeting the needs, the individual needs of the individuals that come to them. So it could work well for you.
And I'd like to add a couple of things to the rural thing. The subject it comes up a lot about, what are rural communities like, and how can we better serve people in rural areas, and what are the challenges, and how do we work with them? And I'm not sure that there's a lot of answers, but like Laurie said, I think a lot of people problem solve a little bit differently when they're in rural areas, and just because they have to. But I wanted to point out a couple of resources that might be helpful, and people might know about these already. But one is the Resource Sharing Project, which is in Iowa. They have several staff members who are very, very trans-informed, and they work specifically on rural issues. So that might be someplace that you may want to reach out to. And one of their staff members is Chris Bine, who did a joint webinar with us a couple of months ago on rural issues and trans people accessing services. So that might be something you might want to listen to. And the other agency that does national-based work is PCAR, NCVRC, out in Pennsylvania. And Eric Stiles works a great deal with transgender survivors and helping providers get on board better. And I know he does technical assistance as well, so he might be another resource for people. Again, Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape or NCVRC.
Okay. You said we will have access to the PowerPoint. Will this also be available as a recorded session in the future? Michael, could you review that?
Sure, yes to both of those things. The PowerPoint will get sent out tomorrow, and generally the archived recording is available tomorrow as well. If we can get it uploaded in time, sometimes that conversion takes a little bit of time. So yes, it's recorded, and yes, it'll be available tomorrow.
And it'll be available on the Forge Forward website.
Yes.
Any other questions? This may be our last call. Thank you, you rock. Thank you very much.
Great. So if,
okay. One more question. You mentioned in your presentation the ACE study and the effects of childhood trauma later in a person's life. Did you find any statistics that show that the rates of childhood trauma are higher for trans youth? What are the methods or resources that you know that are in place to address childhood trauma issues for the LGBT community? I think we do know that we've got higher rates of trauma with trans children, but I can't at the moment think of what those studies would be. What are the methods or resources to address the childhood trauma? Well, Forge's work is specifically with the transgender community. A lot of the anti-violence projects, and you can find a list of them from the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Projects. A lot of those anti-violence projects which focus on LGBT people also have groups or counseling that is focused on helping people heal from childhood abuse. Michael, did you want to comment on that?
I can't think of statistics off the top of my head right now about things. There's definitely a lot of work that's being done on youth, and specifically LGBT youth and the trans piece of that LGBT youth population, especially around things like bullying at schools and homelessness and other rates of violence that are happening in school settings or at home settings. So the research is happening, and it's out there. It should be fairly easy to access some of those things. And I think some of the places or some of the organizations that are working on the issues, not necessarily on helping people heal from those issues, but working on looking at the data and looking at what it means, are the Family Acceptance Project, who are branching out to trans folks as well as LGBT folks. People like GLSEN, I think it's Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. The Transgender Law Center has done a lot of things with youth. So they're looking at, what those rates are and what we can do about it and trying to reduce some of those disparities.
All right, we have reached the end of our questions, Michael. So would you like to wrap up?
Sure. Well, now we all have 15 extra minutes to relax, which is great. So I really appreciate everybody showing up today and your attention and your interest in transgender older adults and trauma. We've said a couple times that the PowerPoints will end up in your email box tomorrow, and the recording will end up online tomorrow that you can access and share with your colleagues. Then we encourage you to share that with your colleagues, because it's the more people that know things, the better it is. And we really value your feedback. So when the webinar closes, you should hopefully get a survey that pops up. It's a couple questions, and we definitely read them every single time, and we make adjustments to our webinars based on what people need and want, and what your feedback is. The next topic for August is on law enforcement, and we will be sending out registration information within the next couple of weeks for that. So we're excited about that subject, because that's another subject that people frequently ask about, is law enforcement as well as rural issues. So again, we really thank you for being here today, and that you care about trans survivors, and you want to make a difference in the world. So thank you very much.